Charles Manson and Neil Young's relationship. Manson was connected to many prominent people in the music industry, Neil Young being one of them. And this isn't some rumor or conspiracy. Neil Young has publicly spoken on multiple occasions about his history with Charles Manson. The following is a segment from the full video I made about Manson's relationship with Neil Young. If you want to see that video, it's linked below. Manson played some songs for me sitting in Dennis Wilson's house. Charlie was always there. Charles Manson and Neil Young not only knew each other, but Neil Young tried to help Charles get signed to a record deal. The two of them were friendly enough that Neil Young even gave Charles Manson a motorcycle as a gift. Yes, a motorcycle. Neil Young himself has said he did this. I'll be sharing that quote with you in a few minutes. After the Manson murders, Neil Young wrote a song based on Charles Manson and the killings. As a matter of fact, Neil Young's friends, particularly David Crosby, were very uncomfortable with that song. I'll be discussing that as well in detail later in this video, but first, how did the connection between Manson and Neil Young even start? In the summer of 1968, over a dozen of Charlie Manson's girls lived in the house of Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. Charles Manson was frequently over at Dennis Wilson's house, which is where he met Neil Young, another close friend of Dennis Wilson's. The following is from journalist Lee Thomas for Far Out magazine. Quote, Neil Young semi-regularly encountered Charles Manson. Manson was often at the house of Beach Boys co-founder Dennis Wilson. Neil Young would also visit Dennis's house regularly. Thus, somewhat bizarrely, Neil Young had jammed with Manson. Neil Young even helped Manson write new music. Furthermore, Neil Young gave Charles Manson a motorcycle as a gift. And Neil Young tried to help Manson secure a professional record deal. He was impressed by Manson's creative songwriting ability and saw the success that Manson's captivating persona could have. As Neil Young himself once recalled, he spoke to Warner Brothers executive Mo Austin about Manson. I told Mo Austin about him. This guy, Charles, is unbelievable. He makes up songs as he goes along, and they're all good. But regardless, the label wasn't interested. In any case, Neil Young once told journalist Nick Kent that Manson was great. He was unreal. I met him maybe 2-3 times at Dennis Wilson's house. I spent the afternoon with him, Dennis, and all those girls, Linda Kasabian, Squeaky Frome, the girls. Though they only paid attention to Charlie. He was an angry man, but brilliant. Wrong, but stone brilliant. He sounds like Bob Dylan when he talks. In quite possibly the biggest understatement about Manson you'll hear, Young later added, he seemed a little uptight, a little too intense. He was a frustrated artist and spent a lot of time in jail. As a songwriter, he would make up songs as he went along. New stuff all the time, no two songs he did were the same. I remember playing a little guitar while he was making up songs. Strong will, that guy. He's like one of the main movers and shakers of the time, but he was kind of skewed. You can tell by reading his words, he's really smart, very deceptive. Manson, speaking in 1995 from his prison cell in California, told an interviewer that at the time he was trying to break into the music industry in the late 60s, no one gave him anything apart from Neil Young, who curiously and perhaps a bit randomly gave Manson a motorcycle. After being informed of Manson's interview, Young replied, Charlie remembers me, huh? Everybody else ripped him off, but I gave him a motorcycle. I turned out to be a good guy. End of article. So, according to Neil Young, he had only met Charles Manson 2 to 3 times, yet he literally gave him a motorcycle as a gift. Now, I've been trying to find the context as to why he gave him that motorcycle, but nothing really explanatory is popping up anywhere. In any case, gifting a literal motorcycle is a pretty big gesture, especially when you consider Neil Young is claiming he only met Manson possibly 2 times. In respect to Neil Young, I'll take him for his word, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but it just comes across a bit unrealistic that you would gift a guy a motorcycle you've only met 2 to 3 times, and that you would advocate for him to get a record deal with one of the biggest record executives in the country. It just comes across a bit hard to believe, I'm going to be honest here, but again, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. In any case, the following is about Charles Manson and Neil Young by Allison Rapp for Ultimate Classic Rock. Quote, before he was a convicted murderer, Charles Manson was an aspiring musician who at one point rubbed shoulders with Neil Young. That was thanks to Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. Wilson and Manson had become friends in 1968, occasionally making music, hanging out with girls, and experimenting with drugs. None of which would have raised too many eyebrows at the time, even if Manson appeared a bit more intense than the other people around him. Sometime, Charlie Manson, who's a friend of mine, says he's God and the devil. He sings, plays, and writes poetry. Dennis Wilson said that to Rave magazine in 1968. In 2017, Dennis's Beach Boys bandmate Mike Love recalled the following to ABC News. Dennis was enthralled by him at one point, and it didn't hurt that Manson came with this group of girls, young girls who were very enamored with Charlie and looked up to him as a leader. Again, that was from Mike Love, Dennis's former bandmate. It seemed that as far as Dennis Wilson was concerned, Manson was simply an eccentric but well-liked upcoming artist who had an interest in pursuing music more seriously. Charles had expressed a desire to meet with the executive Mo Austin from Reprise Records, Warner Brothers. And so Wilson introduced Charles to Neil Young. Neil Young was signed to that record label and he knew Mo Austin. Like Dennis, Young also found Manson to be somewhat over the top and strange, but creative nevertheless. He had this kind of music that no one was doing, Young explained in a 1985 interview with writer Bill Flanagan. Young would add the following. Charles would sit down with the guitar and start playing and making up stuff, different every time. It just kept coming out, coming out, coming out. Then he would stop, and you would never hear that one again. Musically, I thought he was very unique. I thought he really had something crazy, something great. He was like a living poet. He had a lot of girls around at the time, and I thought, well, this guy has a lot of girlfriends. Again, that was from a 1985 interview with Neil Young. In 2012, Neil Young wrote the following in his biography, Waging Heavy Peace. Manson's songs were off-the-cuff things he made up as he went along, and they were never the same twice in a row. Kind of like Bob Dylan, but different because it was hard to glimpse a true message in them. But nevertheless, Manson's songs were fascinating. He was quite good. Now, in terms of Neil Young saying that Manson was quite good, Manson was able to even audition for producer Terry Melcher, who'd worked on the first two albums for the Byrds. However, Melcher declined to sign Manson, and both he and Dennis Wilson moved on from the relationship. Of course, nothing ever became of Manson's music career. In 1971, he was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of 7 people, including actress Sharon Tate. The murders, of course, took place in August of 1969. In 1985, Neil Young said the following, I don't know why he did what he did, but I think Manson was very frustrated in not being able to get a record deal, and he blames somebody. But I don't know what happened. I don't know what they got into. I remember there was a lot of energy whenever he was around, and Manson was different. You could tell he was different. All you have to do is look at him. Once you've seen him, you can never forget him. I'll tell you that. There's just something about him that's, I just can't forget it. I don't know what you would even call it, but I wouldn't want to call it anything in an interview. I would just like to forget about it. Again, that was Neil Young in 1985. Now, not all that long after Manson's conviction in the early 70s, Neil Young wrote a song inspired by the events from the perspective of a bloodthirsty killer. That song was called Revolution Blues, and it appeared on his 1974 album On the Beach. The lyrics include the following. Well, I heard that Laurel Canyon is full of famous stars, but I hate them worse than lepers and I'll kill them in their cars. End of article. Revolution Blues is the third track from Neil Young's album On the Beach. The album was released on July 19, 1974, about 5 years after the Manson murders. By 1974, Neil Young was a very famous, successful musician. On the Beach is his 5th solo album. However, when Neil Young first met Charles Manson in 1968, Neil was not yet nearly as famous as he would become. In 1968, Neil Young hadn't even released his first solo album yet. However, 2 years earlier, in 1966, Neil Young co-founded Buffalo Springfield, and by the time he met Manson in '68, Neil Young did have several well-established, powerful music industry connections, which Manson hoped to use to his advantage. Young did try to help Manson get a major label record deal, but of course that never panned out. As a quick side note, if Manson did get a record deal and became a famous musician, what would have happened to the Manson family? Would he have disbanded the family or kept them along as his loyal followers? More importantly, would some sort of murders still have taken place eventually? I am making a separate video that will explore these alternative timelines. Keep an eye out for that one. Now, going back to Neil Young, as mentioned, Revolution Blues is the third track from his album On the Beach. It was not released as a single, though it is arguably the most famous song from the album. It's certainly the most controversial. Another famous musician, Neil Young's longtime collaborator David Crosby, played rhythm guitar on Revolution Blues. However, although David Crosby played on the album version of Revolution Blues, he did not feel comfortable playing that song live. As a matter of fact, even when it came to the album recording of that song, Crosby wasn't completely comfortable with it. According to the book Neil Young, Long May You Run, David said to Neil, "Don't sing about that. David Crosby, of course, was referring to the dark subject matter of the lyrics. The following is from Stephen L. Jones for SingOut.com. Quote, David Crosby at first wanted nothing to do with the song. Crosby was deeply spooked by the Manson murders and had a fear of overzealous, drugged-out fans. Plus, David Crosby was aware that Neil Young knew Charles Manson. End quote. After the Manson murders, David Crosby armed himself and famously stated, "They're killing all the people with estates." The following is from theweek.com. Quote, Crosby is very afraid of being murdered. He owns guns for self-protection. After he was busted on a firearm charge in the 1980s, his public explanation for why he was carrying a weapon consisted of 2 words, John Lennon. He actually began carrying years earlier after the Manson gang committed the 1969 Sharon Tate murders. The Sharon Tate murders took place just a half mile from Crosby's home. As David Crosby once recalled, when that happened, I said, I think I'm gonna go get me a 12-gauge shotgun. And I did. Later on, I got a .45 handgun. I've always been a gunner, it's just part of my thing. But no, it's not really based on a reasonable fear. I think you're probably better off calling 911. End quote. Bottom line, even though he plays on the studio recording of Revolution Blues, Neil Young's close friend David Crosby was not comfortable with that song. 1974, the year the song was released, also happened to be the year Neil Young and David Crosby's band, CSNY, had their reunion tour. CSNY ended up playing Revolution Blues live, which, according to Neil Young, made David Crosby very uncomfortable. In 1985, Neil Young said the following in an interview with NME, New Musical Express. Quote, well, in 1974, I wasn't touring solo at the time, so I ended up playing Revolution Blues on the CSNY tour instead. David Crosby especially was very uncomfortable. End quote. Again, the Charles Manson-inspired lyrics to the song are what bothered Crosby. For instance, in Revolution Blues, the lyric 10 million dune buggies is a reference to Manson's plan to assemble forces in the desert to carry out his race war. Of course, there's also the infamous closing lines of the song. Well, I hear that Laurel Canyon is full of famous stars, but I hate them worse than lepers and I'll kill them in their cars. The following is from songfacts.com. Quote, according to Neil Young, the biggest obstacle to Manson achieving fame was that he was so improvisational and unpredictable that a band wouldn't have been able to keep up with him. This was all before the murders, of course. Young has continued to be honest about the respect he had for Manson before the terrible crimes. Neil Young has insinuated that many other Laurel Canyon musicians felt the same way about Manson that he did, but none of them would be as willing to admit their association with him. End quote. In a 1985 interview, Neil Young said the following about Manson. Quote, I can see these things in other people. You can see it and feel it. Manson would sing a song and just make it up as he went for 3 or 4 minutes, and he would never repeat one word, and it all made perfect sense. It shook you up to listen to it. It was so good that it scared you. End quote. I believe that interview was also with NME. Now, as mentioned earlier, Charles Manson did receive a motorcycle from Neil Young. As a matter of fact, Charles Manson did have ties with a notorious motorcycle gang called the Straight Satans. This idiotic motorcycle gang is actually one of the reasons the murder of Gary Hinman took place. I'll be getting back to Neil Young in just a minute, but first I want to touch on the Gary Hinman murder and how this motorcycle gang essentially triggered the first famous Manson-related killing. Gary Hinman was not a member of the Manson family. However, he got caught up in Manson family drama thanks largely to Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby himself was not a quote-unquote official member of the Manson family, but he was close to Charles Manson. In late July of 1969, Bobby Beausoleil bought mescaline, a psychedelic drug from Gary Hinman. According to some sources, including CharlesManson.com, Bobby bought the mescaline for the Manson-associated Straight Satan's motorcycle gang. The leader of the motorcycle gang, Danny DiCarlo, was even living at the Manson family Spawn Ranch. The motorcycle gang, particularly Danny DiCarlo, were not happy with the quality of the drug Bobby Beausoleil bought them. Subsequently, Danny DiCarlo forced Bobby Beausoleil to go back to Gary Hinman's house and demand he return the money that was spent on the mescaline. Long story short, one thing led to another, and eventually, Manson himself showed up at Gary's house and slashed Gary across the face with a knife. Here's the massive irony. Bobby Beausoleil initially asked Gary Hinman for $1,000. When Hinman refused to give it to him, there was an argument. But Bobby and Gary did eventually come to an agreement about some sort of compensation for the bad mescaline. This included Gary giving Bobby both of his cars. So, just as all that got settled, Manson arrived and slashed Gary in the face, setting into motion a series of terrible events. If Manson was able to control his temper and his violent tendencies, a lot of things would have been different. After slashing Gary in the face, Manson subsequently left the house and dumped the problem on Bobby to deal with. Gary Hinman, understandably, wanted to go to a hospital to get his injury looked after, but Bobby tried to stop him. He was afraid that Gary might talk to authorities about everything. Eventually, Bobby killed Gary Hinman. Again, all this started because the motorcycle gang forced Bobby to go back to Gary's house. The following is from charlesmanson.com. Quote, after Manson slashed Gary Hinman and left the house, Beausoleil eventually phoned Spawn Ranch and asked for advice on what to do. Manson came to the phone, told Beausoleil he was on his own, and hung up. Gary Hinman made additional demands to be allowed to go to the hospital. In a state of panic and desperation, Beausoleil made the decision to kill Hinman. Bobby stabbed Gary once in the chest. When Gary did not immediately fall, Bobby stabbed him a second time. In court testimony, the coroner said that the second stab wound was almost instantly fatal. At the crime scene, Bobby tried to make it look as though Hinman had been killed by someone else. Bobby drew the words "political pig" on the wall in Gary's blood. Bobby also painted an animal paw mark on the wall, supposedly to make it appear as though the Black Panthers did it. In a 1981 interview with Truman Capote, Bobby revealed that Gary Hinman stated he would disclose information about Manson attacking him. According to Bobby, that's why he killed him on July 27, 1969. A week and a half later, on August 6, 1969, Bobby was arrested in San Luis Obispo, about 3.5 hours north of Los Angeles. Bobby was driving one of Gary Hinman's vehicles. The car broke down on the freeway, and the knife used to kill Gary Hinman was in the car. End quote. The Gary Hinman murder essentially served as the quote-unquote blueprint for the Tate LaBianca murders 2 weeks later. Death by knife stabbings and blood writings on the walls of the deceased. Manson killer Susan Atkins was present at Gary Hinman's house when Bobby Beausoleil killed him. There were actually 2 Manson girls present at Hinman's house when Bobby killed him, Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner. Mary was not involved in the Sharon Tate killings. Susan was. Early in the morning on August 9th, just 2 days after Bobby's arrest, Sharon Tate's house was attacked. Susan Atkins wrote the word pig on the front door of Sharon's house using Sharon's blood. Susan Atkins claimed she was inspired to do this because of what Bobby did at Gary's house. Remember, Bobby tried to frame the Black Panthers. Therefore, by doing the same type of blood writing at Sharon Tate's house, Susan and the other Manson family members were trying to make it seem as though the Panthers were also behind the Sharon Tate killings. If people learned that Sharon Tate was murdered by the Panthers in the same way Gary Hinman was killed by the Panthers, then Bobby Beausoleil would be viewed as innocent. It couldn't have been Bobby, it was the Black Panthers. This was the Manson family logic. Insane, but then again, the entire Manson family was insane. Bottom line, if you connect the dominoes, the Straight Satan's motorcycle gang set into motion the series of events which led to Gary Hinman's murder. So, with all that said, going back to Neil Young, I'm curious if the motorcycle Neil Young gifted Charles Manson wound up in the hands of the motorcycle gang. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that Neil Young had a connection with that gang, nor am I suggesting Neil Young was even aware of Manson's connection with the Straight Satans. But regardless, it would be interesting to know if the Neil Young motorcycle somehow ended up in the hands of the motorcycle gang. Anyways, now going back to the relationship between Neil Young and Charles Manson, the following is from thethings.com by Aya Tsintsiras. In this article, Neil Young is quoted as saying, after a while, a guy showed up, picked up my guitar, and started playing songs on it. He's referring, of course, to Charles Manson. Now, what is not clear is where he says a guy showed up. Showed up where exactly? I'm assuming he's referring to Dennis Wilson's house, but it's not completely clear. Quote, in his book, Young wrote something memorable about a surprising figure, Charles Manson. Young wrote that Manson's musical talents were similar to Bob Dylan's. As Neil Young wrote, after a while, a guy showed up, picked up my guitar, and started playing songs on it. His name was Charlie, kind of like Dylan, but different. As many publications have noted, Neil Young and Charles Manson seem to be at the same parties and have the same social circle. There's no evidence, however, that they were actually friends. And it's important to note that Young has only said positive things about Manson's music, not anything else. They didn't have a close friendship, but from what Neil Young has said, it sounds like him and Manson talked about music quite a lot. In the 60s, Neil Young wasn't the household name he is today, but he was working hard at his career. His debut self-titled album was released in 1968. By the end of the 70s, Young would be a massive rock star with many successful albums. Now, going back to his connection to Manson, Neil Young's song Revolution Blues from his 1974 album On the Beach was about Charles Manson's crimes. The lyrics are intense and paint a picture of the unnerving vibe in California at the time. Young wrote in the song, "Well, I'm a barrel of laughs with my carbine on. I keep 'em hoppin' till my ammunition's gone. But I'm still not happy. I feel like there's something wrong." Over the years, Neil Young doesn't seem to have said much about this specific song. Perhaps because he said everything he wanted to say in the lyrics. End of article.